The first sign something was wrong was the silence. At 7 o'clock on a Saturday night, La Meridian should have been alive with sound. Crystal glasses chimed softly against polished tables. Forks touched porcelain plates. Low conversations floated under the warm glow of the chandeliers like a quiet orchestra of wealth. But when the front door opened, the music of the room faltered. Sonia Williams felt the shift before she even turned around. She was halfway through refilling a water glass when a draft slipped across the floor and brushed against her ankles. The cold air carried a smell that didn't belong inside a restaurant where every plate cost more than most people's grocery bills. Street dust, old fabric, rain that had dried days ago. She looked up. A man stood in the doorway. His jacket was faded, the elbows worn thin enough to show threads. His pants were stained with the kind of marks that never came out, no matter how many times they were washed. His beard had grown wild and uneven, and his shoes looked like they had walked through half the city. Every conversation in the dining room slowed. Not stopped, just slowed. The hostess froze with her menu held halfway to her chest. 2 tables away, a woman in a silk dress wrinkled her nose. Sonia watched it happen the way it always did. The invisible wall forming between people who belonged and someone who didn't. The security guard near the entrance shifted his weight and moved closer. One hand, already drifting toward the radio, clipped to his belt. "Sir," the hostess said carefully, her voice polite but strained. "I'm afraid you may be in the wrong place." The man didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry either. He simply stood there, shoulders straight, eyes scanning the room slowly, tables, exits, ceiling corners. Watching. Not like someone who had been beaten down by life. Like someone who was studying it. Sonia noticed that immediately. Most people didn't. Before the moment could stretch any further, Ricky Thornton appeared. Ricky had managed La Meridian for 5 years, and he moved through the restaurant like a man who believed he owned every inch of the floor beneath his shoes. His smile was already in place when he approached the doorway. "Good evening," Ricky said smoothly. His voice carried the kind of polished friendliness that Sonia had learned to recognize as a warning. "I think you've made a mistake." The man finally spoke. "Table 7. His voice was calm, quiet, certain. Ricky blinked once. "I'm afraid we don't have—" The man reached into his jacket pocket. For a split second, Sonia expected nothing. Maybe loose change. Maybe nothing at all. Instead, a thick bundle of cash appeared in his hand. The soft brush of bills sliding against each other cut through the quiet like a blade. A few nearby diners turned openly now. Ricky's smile flickered. Greed and irritation flashed across his face so quickly most people wouldn't have seen it. Sonia did. "Wagyu A5, the man said. He held the money out between them. Medium rare. A murmur spread through the dining room. The steak he had just ordered cost nearly $500. Ricky hesitated. Technically, the rules were simple. A paying guest could not be refused. Even if that guest didn't look like the kind of person who belonged among crystal chandeliers and $1,000 wine bottles. "Of course," Ricky said finally. The smile returned, tighter now. "This way." But he didn't guide the man toward the elegant window tables where couples leaned close over candlelight. He led him deeper into the restaurant, past the bar, past the quiet corners, to table 7, the worst seat in the building. It sat wedged between the swinging kitchen doors and the hallway leading to the restrooms. Every few seconds, the kitchen door burst open with the crash of dishes and the smell of grease drifting out behind it. It was where customers were placed when management wanted them to feel uncomfortable enough to leave. The man sat down without complaint. That alone made Sonia uneasy. Ricky turned slowly and scanned the room until his eyes landed on her. "You," he said. Sonia straightened. "Yes? You're always talking about helping people in need." His voice carried just enough volume for nearby diners to hear. "Here's your chance." A few people chuckled quietly. Sonia picked up the water pitcher from the service station. Her feet moved automatically, carrying her across the polished floor toward table 7. She could feel the eyes following her, watching, judging. She poured water into the glass in front of the man. The clear stream splashed softly against the ice. For a moment, she avoided looking at him. Then she did. His eyes were dark, sharp, focused on her face with an intensity that made her pause. There was something strange about him. Not the clothes, not the smell. Something else. Awareness, like he was reading the room the way a chess player reads a board. "You'll have your steak shortly," Sonia said quietly. The man nodded once. "Thank you." His voice was steady. Calm. Across the room, Ricky watched the table closely. His expression carried the thin smile of someone who believed the situation was already under control. But Sonia felt something else entirely. A tension she couldn't explain. As she turned to walk back toward the service station, the kitchen doors slammed open again behind her. The smell of seared beef and butter drifted out into the dining room. And somewhere behind those doors, a decision was about to be made that would change everything that happened next. The kitchen behind the swinging doors was louder than the dining room. Metal clanged against metal. Pans hissed as butter hit hot steel. The sharp smell of garlic and seared beef hung thick in the air, mixed with the sting of cleaning chemicals that never quite faded from the tiled floor. Sonia pushed through the kitchen doors with her empty water pitcher. The noise of the dining room disappeared behind her. Inside, the rhythm was faster, harsher. Cooks moved shoulder to shoulder in the narrow space, their white jackets already marked with grease and heat. Orders were shouted across the line. 2 ribeyes, fire! Salmon walking. Table 12 ready. Sonia set the pitcher beside the sink and reached for a clean tray, pretending to check a stack of plates. Her eyes drifted toward the grill station. Carlos Taylor stood there, turning a steak with careful precision. Sweat beaded along his temples under the bright kitchen lights. The heat from the grill shimmered through the air. Carlos was good at his job. Everyone knew that. But tonight his movements looked slower than usual. Nervous. Before Sonia could say anything, Ricky stepped through the kitchen doors behind her. His polished shoes looked out of place on the tile floor. "Carlos," he said quietly. The noise of the kitchen swallowed most conversations, but Sonia noticed how Ricky tilted his head toward the far corner near the spice rack. The blind spot. No camera there. Everyone on staff knew it. Carlos hesitated for a moment before stepping away from the grill. Sonia kept her back turned, stacking plates slowly. Ricky lowered his voice, but the kitchen carried sound strangely. Words traveled along the metal surfaces and bounced through the room. "The Wagyu for table 7, Ricky said. Carlos nodded. "Already started." "Not that one." There was a pause. Sonia's hand stopped moving. "What do you mean?" Carlos asked. "The one from yesterday." Carlos looked confused. "The return?" Ricky's tone sharpened. "Yes, that one." Sonia felt a small chill move through her stomach. Carlos frowned. "Ricky, that steak sat out for almost 2 hours before we put it back in the freezer." "So?" "So it's compromised." The grill crackled loudly between them. Carlos lowered his voice even more. "If he eats that, he could get seriously sick." Ricky laughed softly. The sound carried no humor. "Relax." He leaned closer to Carlos, his voice calm and cold. "Who's going to believe a homeless man over a 5-star restaurant?" The words hung in the air. Sonia's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. Carlos didn't answer. Ricky continued. "He probably eats out of dumpsters anyway. Think of it as an upgrade." Carlos shook his head slowly. "That's not right." Ricky's expression hardened. "You remember that bottle of wine you dropped last month?" Carlos stiffened. "The one worth $2,000, Ricky continued. "The one I told accounting not to charge you for." Carlos's eyes flickered. Fear. Ricky straightened his jacket. "You've got a baby coming in 2 months, right?" Carlos didn't respond. Ricky gave him a small smile. "Then I suggest you cook the steak." The kitchen noise filled the silence that followed. Carlos stood there for several seconds. Finally, he nodded once. "Fine." Ricky clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Good man." He turned and walked back toward the dining room. The moment he was gone, Carlos let out a slow breath. Only then did he notice Sonia. She was standing just behind the spice rack, still, watching. Carlos's face went pale. "You heard that?" he said quietly. Sonia didn't answer. She didn't need to. Carlos shook his head quickly. "Forget it." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That steak is spoiled." Carlos looked away. "I know. You can't serve it." He turned back to the grill, grabbing the tongs again. "I don't have a choice." "You always have a choice." Carlos laughed bitterly. "You think so?" He pointed the tongs toward the dining room. "That man out there? He's homeless. No family. No lawyer. No one who cares what happens to him. Carlos placed the steak on the grill. The meat sizzled immediately. But I have a wife, he said quietly. And a baby on the way. Sonia stared at the steak. The smell rising from the grill was rich and buttery. Perfect. Anyone looking at it would believe it was the finest cut of meat in the restaurant. Carlos kept speaking without looking at her. If I lose this job, I lose my apartment. He flipped the steak. And if I lose my apartment, my wife loses her health insurance. The meat crackled. I'm not a bad person, he said. I'm just trapped. Sonia didn't respond. Her thoughts had already moved somewhere else. To Lily. Her daughter's inhaler sitting on the kitchen counter at home. The prescription refill she still hadn't paid for. The doctor's appointment scheduled next week. If she lost this job, she forced the thought away. Carlos slid the steak onto a white porcelain plate. Steam curled upward. Just go back out there, he said softly. Pretend you didn't hear anything. Sonia watched him drizzle sauce across the meat. It looked flawless, beautiful, deadly. Carlos, she said quietly. He didn't look up. Please don't make this harder than it already is. The plate was finished. Carlos pushed it toward the service counter. Sonia stood frozen for a moment. In the dining room beyond the doors, she could hear the soft hum of conversation returning. The man at table 7 was still sitting there, waiting. Carlos wiped his hands on a towel. Someone will take it out, he said. Sonia stepped forward and picked up the plate. The porcelain was warm against her fingers. The smell of the steak rose toward her face. Butter, pepper, something slightly sour beneath it, almost hidden. Carlos looked at her sharply. What are you doing? Sonia lifted the tray. Her voice was steady. Serving the order. Carlos stared at her. Don't say anything out there, he warned. Sonia didn't answer. She pushed through the kitchen doors and stepped back into the warm light of the dining room. Behind her, the grill continued to hiss. Ahead of her, table 7 waited. The dining room felt warmer than the kitchen, but Sonia's hands were colder. She carried the plate through the narrow aisle between tables. The porcelain balanced perfectly on her palm. The steak still sizzled softly under the dim chandelier light, releasing a rich smell of butter and pepper that drifted through the air. To everyone watching, it looked perfect. But Sonia knew what was hiding underneath. Table 7 waited in the corner. The man sat exactly where she had left him, his posture relaxed, hands folded near the menu. The noise of the kitchen doors thumped behind him every few seconds. He looked up when she approached. His eyes were sharp, steady, and far too calm for someone who had just been insulted by half the room. Sonia placed the plate down in front of him. Your Wagyu A5, sir, she said quietly. The man nodded once. Thank you. She stepped away from the table, but her mind refused to move with her. The steak remained in her vision, the steam rising from it, the dangerous truth hidden beneath the sauce. She returned to the service station, forcing her hands to keep moving, stacking forks, straightening napkins, polishing glasses. But her eyes kept drifting back toward table 7. The man hadn't touched the food yet. He simply sat there, observing the room, watching. The small black camera domes mounted along the ceiling caught the light above the dining room. Sonia glanced at them instinctively. There were 6 covering the main floor, 1 above the bar, 2 near the entrance. Ricky reviewed every recording at night. Everyone knew that. Last month he had fired a busboy after spotting him sitting down for 5 minutes between shifts. The cameras saw everything. Everything except one place. The staff bathroom. The thought struck her suddenly. Sonia felt her pulse quicken. If she spoke to the man directly, the cameras would capture it. Ricky would know immediately. But if she wrote something, her fingers drifted slowly toward the pocket of her apron. The small order pad rested there. A pen clipped to the top. Her heart began beating harder. Before she could move, a shadow fell beside her. Sonia. Ricky's voice was smooth and quiet. She turned. He stood close enough that she could smell his cologne again, sharp and expensive. His eyes flicked briefly toward table 7. You've been staring at our guest for a while, he said. Sonia forced a neutral expression, just checking if he needs anything. Ricky followed her gaze toward the corner. The man was still sitting calmly, the steak untouched. Don't worry, Ricky said softly. He'll eat. There was something unsettling about the way he said it, like the outcome was already decided. Ricky leaned slightly closer. You have a lot to lose, Sonia, he added quietly. His smile returned as a couple at the nearby table waved for his attention. Don't do anything stupid. He walked away. Sonia remained standing at the service station. Her chest felt tight. She looked again toward table 7. The man still hadn't touched the steak. Something about that gave her a strange feeling, as if he was waiting. Not hungry, waiting. Sonia turned abruptly and walked toward the hallway leading to the staff area. The corridor was empty. The hum of the dining room faded as she stepped into the staff bathroom and closed the door behind her. The fluorescent light flickered once overhead. She locked the door. The mirror above the sink reflected a tired woman in a black uniform, hair tied tightly back, dark circles beneath her eyes. Sonia stared at her own reflection. Don't do anything stupid. Ricky's words echoed in her mind. She thought about Lily, her daughter sleeping in their small apartment across town, the inhaler sitting beside the bed, the prescription refill waiting at the pharmacy. If Sonia lost her job tonight, she pushed the thought away. Another memory replaced it. Her mother's voice, years ago, quiet and serious. There will come a day when doing the right thing costs everything. Sonia reached into her apron pocket. The small order pad slid into her hand. She tore off a piece of paper. The sound seemed too loud in the silent bathroom. Her fingers trembled slightly as she uncapped the pen. For a moment, she hesitated. Once she did this, there would be no taking it back. She leaned over the sink and wrote quickly. 3 short sentences. Her handwriting was cramped and uneven. Don't eat. The meat is spoiled. Intentional. They want to hurt you. She stared at the words. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The message felt heavier than the thin paper in her hand. Slowly, she folded it. Once. Twice. Again, until it was small enough to hide against her palm. Sonia slipped the pen back into her apron. She unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The noise of the dining room grew louder as she approached the main floor again. The smell of wine and grilled meat drifted through the air. Everything looked normal, elegant, controlled. But Sonia knew the truth, hiding beneath the surface. She walked toward the service station, pretending to organize silverware again. Her eyes moved carefully around the room. The cameras, the diners, Ricky speaking with a table near the bar. Then table 7. The man sat exactly where she had left him. Still waiting, still watching. The steak cooled slowly in front of him. Sonia closed her fingers around the folded paper in her palm. One movement. That was all it would take. But that single moment could cost her everything. She lifted the tray again and walked toward the corner table. Each step felt heavier than the last. When she reached the table, she placed the utensils beside the plate with steady hands. As she set the fork down, her fingers brushed lightly against the man's hand. The folded paper slid into his palm. So quickly no one watching would notice. "Enjoy your meal, sir," she said quietly. Their eyes met. For a brief moment she wondered if he already knew. Then she turned and walked away. Her heart hammered as she returned to the service station. Behind her, the man slowly lowered his hand beneath the table and unfolded the note. Frank kept his hand beneath the table as he unfolded the small piece of paper. The restaurant continued its quiet rhythm around him, soft laughter, glasses touching, the muted clatter of silverware. No one noticed the tiny movement of his fingers under the white tablecloth. He read the note once. Then again. Don't eat. The meat is spoiled. Intentional. They want to hurt you. For a long moment, he didn't move. The steak in front of him glistened beneath the warm chandelier light. Butter pooled along the edges of the plate, slowly mixing with the dark reduction sauce. The smell rising from it was rich and inviting pepper, char, roasted fat. To everyone else in the room, it looked like perfection. Frank folded the note again and slipped it quietly into the pocket of his worn jacket. Then he looked at the steak. His expression didn't change, but something inside him hardened. Not anger. Not yet. Something older. Something colder. He picked up the knife and fork, letting the metal rest lightly in his hands. For several seconds he studied the meat as if deciding where to make the first cut. But instead of slicing into it, he set the utensils back down beside the plate. The steak remained untouched. Across the room, Sonia watched from the service station. Her heart was beating so loudly she could feel it in her throat. For a moment, she thought he might ignore the note, that he might take a bite anyway, but he didn't. He simply sat there, calm and still, waiting. Relief washed over her so quickly she had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. He understood. At the bar, Ricky noticed the same thing. The man hadn't eaten. 10 minutes had passed. Most diners finished half their meal in that time. Ricky leaned against the polished wood of the bar, pretending to review the reservation tablet while his eyes drifted toward the corner table. The steak still sat exactly where it had been placed, untouched. Ricky frowned. He pushed away from the bar and walked slowly across the dining room. His shoes made almost no sound on the floor. Frank looked up as he approached. "Is everything satisfactory, sir?" Ricky asked smoothly. Frank met his gaze. "The atmosphere is excellent." Ricky forced a small smile. "I'm glad to hear that." His eyes dropped briefly to the plate. "You haven't started your meal." Frank followed his gaze. "It looks perfect." Ricky's fingers tightened slightly against the back of the chair. "But," Frank leaned back slightly, "I'm enjoying the moment." The answer was polite, but something about the way he said it unsettled Ricky. Most customers, especially ones out of place, ate quickly, nervously, as if finishing their meal would make the room stop staring. This man wasn't nervous. He looked comfortable, in control. Ricky felt a faint prickling along the back of his neck. "Please let me know if there's anything we can improve," he said. Frank nodded once. "I will." Ricky lingered for a second longer before stepping away. As he crossed the room again, his eyes moved automatically toward Sonia. She was polishing glasses behind the service counter, but her shoulders were tense. And when she realized he was looking at her, she looked away too quickly. A suspicion began forming in Ricky's mind. Something wasn't right. He turned toward the kitchen doors. Inside, Carlos was wiping down the grill station, the heat still glowing faintly beneath the metal grates. "Carlos," Ricky said quietly. Carlos straightened. "Yes?" "The steak for table 7. Carlos hesitated. "Yes?" "He hasn't touched it." Carlos glanced toward the dining room. "Maybe he's waiting." "For what?" Carlos didn't answer. Ricky stepped closer. "You followed my instructions?" Carlos nodded slowly. "Yes." Ricky studied his face for a moment. Carlos looked nervous. But that wasn't unusual. Everyone was nervous around Ricky. Still, something bothered him. He glanced again toward the dining room. The man at table 7 remained seated, his hands folded calmly beside the plate. "Watching?" Ricky lowered his voice. "Did anyone say anything to him?" Carlos shook his head quickly. "No." Ricky held his gaze for a few seconds longer before turning away. Back in the dining room, Frank lifted his water glass. The ice clinked softly as he took a slow sip. He let his eyes wander around the restaurant. The chandeliers, the marble floors, the wealthy couples leaning toward each other across candlelight. The entire room smelled of money and comfort. But underneath it all, something rotten was hiding. He had built this company to be different. Every person who walked through the door deserved dignity. That had been the promise, the rule. And tonight, inside one of his own restaurants, a man had decided that rule didn't apply. Frank's fingers brushed lightly against the pocket where the folded note rested. The waitress had risked everything to warn him. He could see it now. The way she had avoided the cameras, the quick movement of her hand, the fear in her eyes when their fingers touched. That kind of courage was rare and dangerous. He looked back at the steak. The butter had begun to cool. The surface of the meat had darkened slightly as the heat faded. A meal meant to make him sick, to punish him for sitting where someone like him wasn't supposed to sit. Frank exhaled slowly. Then, he pushed the plate slightly farther away. Across the room, Sonia noticed the movement. The steak was now completely out of reach. He wasn't going to eat it. Not now. Not ever. And somehow that small gesture felt like the first move in a much larger game. The tension in the room continued to grow quietly, unnoticed by most of the diners. But Ricky felt it. He returned to the bar, his eyes fixed on table 7. 30 minutes had passed. The steak was still there, untouched. And for the first time that evening, Ricky began to wonder if he had made a mistake. The longer the steak sat untouched, the heavier the air inside the restaurant became. Ricky could feel it. He stood behind the bar, pretending to review a reservation list on the tablet, but his eyes kept drifting toward the corner table. The man was still there, still calm, still not eating. The steak had cooled enough that the butter on the plate had begun to thicken along the edges. The glossy surface of the meat had lost its shine beneath the chandelier light. No normal customer waited this long. Something was wrong. Ricky glanced around the room. Most diners had returned to their conversations, but a few still stole curious glances toward table 7. Curiosity was dangerous. Scenes were worse. If the man complained, if he called someone, if he made enough noise, one viral video could damage the restaurant's reputation overnight. Ricky couldn't allow that. He smoothed his tie and stepped out from behind the bar. As he crossed the dining room again, his eyes moved automatically toward the service station. Sonia was there, polishing glasses, too carefully, too slowly. The moment she noticed Ricky approaching, she lowered her gaze and focused harder on the cloth in her hands. That was all the confirmation he needed. He stopped beside her. "Sonia." She looked up. "Yes?" Ricky leaned one elbow against the counter, his voice low enough to keep the conversation private but sharp enough to make the meaning clear. "You spoke to him." It wasn't a question. Sonia kept her expression neutral. "I served his table. You did more than that." Her grip tightened slightly around the glass she was holding. "I don't know what you mean." Ricky's smile returned, thin and humorless. "You're not a good liar." Across the room, Frank lifted his water glass again. He watched them without appearing to watch. The tension between the two of them was visible even from a distance. Ricky followed Frank's gaze briefly before looking back at Sonia. "He should have eaten by now," Ricky said quietly. Sonia didn't respond. Ricky leaned closer. "You told him something." "No." Ricky studied her face for a moment. Then he straightened slowly. "Fine." He turned toward the dining room. "If I can't remove the customer," he said calmly, "I'll remove the problem." Sonia felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Ricky stopped near the center of the room and raised his voice just enough for nearby tables to hear. "Sonia Williams." Every conversation within 10 feet faded immediately. Sonia stepped forward. "Yes." Ricky folded his hands neatly in front of him. "I've received complaints about your behavior toward one of our guests." The words landed like a stone dropped into water. "What?" Sonia said. "You were disrespectful," Ricky continued smoothly. "Several customers overheard you making inappropriate comments." "That's not true." Her voice was quiet, but the disbelief was clear. Ricky tilted his head slightly. "Are you calling our guests liars?" Sonia glanced around the room. Faces watched from candlelit tables. No one spoke. No one intervened. Ricky continued. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable in an establishment like this." Sonia felt heat rising in her chest. "I didn't say anything inappropriate." But Ricky was already speaking over her. "In light of the complaints," he said loudly, "you are suspended immediately pending further review." The words echoed across the room. A woman near the bar whispered something to her husband. A waiter near the kitchen doors froze mid-step. Sonia stood perfectly still. Her thoughts moved quickly now. Lily. The rent due next week. The pharmacy receipt still sitting on the kitchen counter. If she lost this job, she forced the thought away. "I did nothing wrong," she said. Her voice was steady. Ricky spread his hands slightly, as if disappointed. "The witnesses say otherwise." "There are no witnesses." Ricky gestured lightly toward the dining room. An entire room of them. But the room remained silent. No one volunteered a word. Most diners avoided her eyes. They hadn't actually heard anything, but they didn't want trouble. They wanted their dinner, their wine, their comfortable evening uninterrupted. Sonia realized something then. She was completely alone. Ricky nodded toward the hallway. "Please collect your belongings and leave the premises." Her throat tightened. For a moment she considered arguing again. But what would be the point? Ricky controlled the cameras, the staff, the story. The humiliation was happening exactly the way he wanted. Across the room, Frank slowly set down his water glass. The faint clink against the table cut through the silence. Everyone turned. He pushed his chair back and stood. The sound of the chair legs sliding across the floor was louder than it should have been. Ricky turned sharply. "Sir, please, this is an internal matter." Frank stepped away from the table. "She didn't say anything inappropriate." His voice was calm, clear. The room went still. Ricky forced a polite smile. "I appreciate your concern, but—" "No." The word stopped him. Frank looked directly at him. She served my meal. That's all. Sonia stared at him. She hadn't expected him to speak. No customer had ever stepped in before. Ricky's smile began to fade. With respect, he said carefully. You may not have heard the full conversation. Frank's gaze didn't move. I heard enough. Ricky felt the strange tension return again. The same feeling he had noticed earlier. Something about this man was wrong. Not the clothes. Not the smell. Something deeper. Something confident. Dangerously confident. Ricky's voice hardened slightly. Sir, I'm asking you not to interfere. Frank took another step forward. The room felt smaller now. More crowded. More focused. And for the first time that evening, Ricky realized something unsettling. The man standing in front of him didn't look like someone who was about to leave. He looked like someone who was about to change everything. For several seconds, no one moved. The dining room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves had leaned closer to watch what would happen next. Ricky stared at the man standing in front of him. The clothes still told one story: worn jacket, scuffed shoes, the smell of the street lingering faintly beneath the perfume and candle smoke. But the man's posture told another. He stood straight, unshaken. The kind of calm that didn't belong to someone who had just been threatened with removal. Ricky forced a laugh. Sir, he said, keeping his voice pleasant, this situation doesn't concern you. The man's eyes didn't leave his. You accused her in front of... A murmur passed through the nearby tables. Ricky noticed it immediately. The attention of the room was shifting. That was the last thing he wanted. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've already been allowed to stay here longer than most people in your position would. His smile thinned. I suggest you finish your meal and leave. The man glanced briefly toward the untouched plate at the corner table. Interesting suggestion. The response made Ricky's jaw tighten. He turned slightly toward Sonia. See? Ricky said, raising his voice again so the room could hear. Your behavior has disrupted the dining experience for multiple guests. Sonia felt the weight of every eye in the restaurant pressing against her. The chandeliers overhead glowed warmly, but she suddenly felt cold. Ricky was doing exactly what she feared he would do, turning the room against her. You should go, Ricky continued, before this becomes worse. Sonia looked around the dining room one last time. No one spoke. The other servers kept their heads down. A couple near the window whispered to each other. Carlos stood half-hidden behind the kitchen doors, his face pale, his hands gripping the metal frame. But he said nothing. Fear held him exactly where Ricky expected. Sonia understood then. If she walked out now, Ricky would win. He would erase the truth. The poisoned steak would disappear. Tomorrow the story would be simple. A difficult customer. A careless waitress. Problem solved. But if she stayed, her job would be gone anyway. Ricky folded his arms. Well? Sonia lifted her chin slightly. I didn't do anything wrong. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly across the quiet room. Ricky sighed, as if disappointed. That's unfortunate. He reached into his pocket and removed a small tablet used for staff reports. I'm documenting the incident now. He tapped the screen. Employee misconduct. Disrupting guests. Each word sounded deliberate. Permanent. Sonia felt her chest tighten. This was how Ricky destroyed people. Not by shouting, by writing. A record that would follow her to every other restaurant in the city. Ricky looked up again. Last chance, he said calmly. Leave. The man beside them spoke again. She's not leaving. Ricky's patience snapped. I wasn't speaking to you. The man tilted his head slightly. That seems to be a pattern tonight. The remark drew a few quiet laughs from nearby tables. Ricky's face flushed. You're testing my patience. And you're testing your luck. The words landed harder than they sounded. Ricky's hand tightened around the tablet. You think I can't have you removed? He asked. You can try. The man's voice remained even. Something about that calmness made Ricky's pulse spike. He had dealt with difficult customers before. Drunks, angry businessmen, influencers demanding special treatment. They all behaved the same way. Loud, emotional, predictable. This man wasn't any of those things. He looked certain. Ricky gestured toward the security guard near the entrance. Mark. The guard straightened immediately. Escort this gentleman out. Several diners leaned forward in their chairs. The room buzzed with anticipation. But before the guard could move, the man did something unexpected. He reached down and began removing his shoe. A few people gasped softly. The guard hesitated, confused. Ricky frowned. "What are you doing?" The man didn't answer. He turned the shoe slightly in his hands, then pressed his thumb along the sole. A small compartment opened. Inside was a phone, a sleek black device no larger than a credit card. He removed it calmly and held it up. The dining room fell silent again. Ricky felt the blood drain from his face. "What is that?" he asked. The man brushed a small piece of dust from the screen. "Insurance." He pressed a button. The phone vibrated softly in his hand. Somewhere outside, across the street, a signal activated. Inside the restaurant, no one spoke. Sonia stared at the device. The same man who had looked like a homeless customer only an hour ago now stood in the center of the room, holding something that felt far more powerful than money. Ricky tried to recover. "This is ridiculous," he said sharply. "You can't record people without permission." The man looked directly at him. "I can record conversations I'm part of." His eyes didn't blink. "And that includes the one that happened in your kitchen." Carlos felt his stomach drop. Ricky's expression flickered. Just for a moment. But the damage was already done. Several diners exchanged uneasy glances. The guard near the door stopped moving. Ricky laughed nervously. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" The man slipped the phone back into his hand and looked toward the entrance. 30 seconds passed. Then the restaurant door opened. The sharp click of heels echoed across the marble floor as a woman in a charcoal suit stepped inside. Behind her came 2 men carrying briefcases, and 4 members of a private security team. Every head in the dining room turned. The woman walked straight toward the center of the room, toward the man with the worn jacket, and stopped beside him. Ricky suddenly felt the room tilt beneath his feet, because the woman didn't look at him. She looked at the man and spoke with absolute respect. "Mr. Grant," she said calmly, "we're ready." For a moment, no one in the restaurant seemed to breathe. The woman in the charcoal suit stood beside the man with the worn jacket, her posture perfectly composed, as if everything happening in the room was exactly as expected. "Mr. Grant," she repeated calmly. The name moved through the restaurant like a ripple through still water. Some diners frowned in confusion. Others went pale almost instantly. Ricky's mind tried to catch up with what he had just heard. Grant. The name sounded familiar in a distant, uncomfortable way, like something printed on documents he rarely read carefully. But the pieces didn't connect. Not yet. The woman continued, her voice steady and professional. "Your legal team is here." The 2 men behind her lifted their briefcases slightly, as if confirming the statement. The private security officers spread out quietly near the entrance, their presence controlled but unmistakable. The man everyone had assumed was homeless looked down briefly at the phone, still resting in his hand. Then he slipped it back into the small compartment inside the sole of his shoe and calmly put the shoe back on. When he stood upright again, something about him had changed. Or perhaps it had been there all along, hidden beneath the dirt and worn fabric. Confidence. Authority. The kind that didn't come from money alone. It came from certainty, from knowing exactly who you were. He brushed a faint line of dust from his jacket sleeve and looked toward the center of the room. Then his eyes settled on Ricky. "You were saying something about having me removed," he said quietly. Ricky opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The diners around them began whispering now. Phones appeared discreetly in hands. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had started as a spectacle was turning into something else. Something far more dangerous. Ricky forced himself to speak. This is some kind of misunderstanding." The man's gaze remained steady. "Is it?" Ricky gestured vaguely toward the woman beside him. "I don't know who you think you are bringing people into my restaurant like this." The woman interrupted. "You might want to reconsider that sentence." Her tone wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to be. She reached into a slim leather folder and removed a simple identification card. The restaurant's logo gleamed faintly beneath the chandelier light. La Meridian. She held it up. Then she spoke clearly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "This is Frank Grant." A pause followed. Then she finished the sentence. "Founder and owner of the entire Laridian restaurant group." The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled through the room. One of the diners near the window actually dropped his wine glass. Ricky felt the blood drain from his face. Floridian Group, his employer. The corporation that owned not just this restaurant, but dozens of luxury locations across the country. He had seen the founder's name printed at the bottom of corporate memos for years, but he had never met him, never even imagined he might. Certainly not like this. Ricky took a step backward. You? That's impossible. Frank tilted his head slightly. Is it? The calmness in his voice made Ricky's stomach twist. The entire dining room was watching now. Even the kitchen staff had begun gathering near the doors, drawn by the sudden silence. Carlos stood there too, frozen. Frank glanced briefly toward the corner table. The steak still sat where it had been placed earlier. Cold, untouched. He turned back toward Ricky. I came here tonight because I received a message, Frank said. His voice carried easily through the room. Someone recorded a video in this restaurant. Several diners shifted uncomfortably. The video showed a man being dragged out by security while customers laughed. Frank paused, and the message asked a simple question. His gaze moved slowly across the dining room. Is this how my restaurants treat people? No one answered. Frank continued. So I decided to see it myself. He gestured casually toward his worn clothes. This seemed like the most honest way to do that. The silence deepened. Across the room, Sonia stood near the service station, her heart racing. She felt dizzy. This man, this quiet customer she had warned, owned the entire company. Frank's eyes moved again, scanning the room until they reached her. Just for a moment, a small acknowledgement. Then he looked back at Ricky. You seated me at table 7, Frank said. Ricky swallowed. It was the only available. Frank raised a hand slightly. You don't need to explain. He nodded toward the plate. You also arranged for that steak. Ricky's face twitched. I don't know what you're talking about. Frank glanced toward the kitchen doors. Carlos. The young chef stiffened. Every eye turned toward him. Carlos stepped forward slowly. Sweat glistened along his forehead. Did you prepare the Wagyu for table 7? Carlos hesitated. Ricky's glare burned into him. But something in Frank's expression held his attention. Not anger. Expectation. Carlos took a breath. Yes. And was that steak fresh? The question hung in the air. Ricky shook his head quickly. This is ridiculous. Frank spoke again, his voice calm. I have the recording. The words landed like a hammer. Carlos closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Frank. No, he said quietly. The room erupted into murmurs. Ricky's voice cracked. Carlos, don't burr. But Carlos continued. It had been returned yesterday. His voice grew steadier. It sat out for nearly 2 hours before we froze it again. Ricky's face went white. Carlos swallowed. Ricky told me to cook it anyway. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Frank nodded once. Then he looked back at Ricky. And for the first time that night, the calmness in his expression faded slightly. Not replaced by anger. Something colder. Disappointment. You tried to poison a guest, Frank said quietly. And you chose the wrong one. The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken. No one in the restaurant moved. Ricky stared at Frank as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. His mouth opened slightly, but the usual confident replies that had carried him through years of arguments and complaints refused to come. You can't prove that, he said finally. The sentence sounded weaker than he intended. Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He simply slipped the small phone from the hidden compartment again and held it up between them. I already did. The device was barely larger than a credit card, its black surface reflecting the soft chandelier light. Frank tapped the screen once. A faint sound crackled through the speaker. Then Ricky's voice filled the room. Clear. Undeniable. Use the one that got sent back yesterday. The one that sat out for 2 hours. Gasps rippled through the dining room. Frank didn't look away from Ricky as the recording continued. Who's going to believe a homeless man over a 5-star restaurant? The words echoed off the marble floor and polished walls. Ricky's face drained of color. Turn that off, he snapped. Frank ignored him. He probably eats out of dumpsters anyway, consider it a favor. The recording ended with the soft hiss of the grill. Silence followed. A long, suffocating silence. Several diners pushed their plates away as if the food in front of them had suddenly become dangerous. A woman near the bar covered her mouth. At the kitchen doorway, Carlos lowered his head. Ricky laughed suddenly. The sound came out sharp and desperate. "This is edited," he said quickly. "Anyone can manipulate audio now." Frank tilted his head slightly. "That would be an interesting defense." Behind him, one of the lawyers stepped forward and opened his briefcase. Inside were several printed documents. He handed one to Frank. Frank glanced at the page briefly, then held it up for Ricky to see. A timestamp sat clearly at the top. 7:18 p.m. kitchen audio capture. Chain of custody signatures ran along the bottom. "The recording has already been backed up to 3 secure servers," the lawyer said calmly, "along with the restaurant's surveillance footage." Ricky's eyes flicked toward the ceiling. The cameras. For the first time that evening, he realized those cameras might not belong to him anymore. "You can't just walk in here and—" Frank raised a hand. "You're right." His voice remained steady. "I can't." He gestured slightly toward the lawyer. "But they can." The lawyer stepped forward again. "Frank Grant authorized a corporate compliance review of this location 1 week ago." Ricky blinked. "What?" "We've been auditing financial records, employee reports, and supplier invoices." The lawyer flipped to another document. "And we found something interesting." He placed the page on the nearest table. Several diners leaned forward to read. A list of inventory numbers filled the sheet. Numbers that didn't match. "Missing product," the lawyer explained. "High-value items disappearing from inventory for the past 3 years." Ricky's breathing became shallow. That's an accounting mistake." "Perhaps," the lawyer said. "But it happens to total nearly $200,000. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Phones were fully raised now. Recording. Frank remained still in the center of it all. "You stole from this restaurant," he said quietly. Ricky shook his head rapidly. "No, I ran this place for 5 years. I made it profitable." "And tonight," Frank replied, "you tried to poison a customer to protect your pride." "That's not what happened." Ricky's voice rose sharply. He turned toward the diners, gesturing wildly. "This is insane." He came in here dressed like that. His voice faltered as he realized what he was about to say. Frank finished the thought for him. "Like someone you didn't respect." Ricky said nothing. Frank gestured toward the plate still sitting on the corner table. The steak had gone completely cold now. "You saw a man you believed had no power," Frank continued. "So you decided he deserved whatever happened to him." The words cut deeper than any accusation, shouted in anger. Ricky looked around the room. The faces watching him were no longer curious. They were disgusted, and some were angry. The wealthy woman who had complained earlier pushed her chair back. "Is that what we've been eating here?" she demanded. Her husband grabbed his phone. "I'm calling my lawyer." Another diner spoke up. "This place should be shut down." Ricky took a step backward. The room was turning against him. "You're all overreacting," he said desperately. "No one actually got hurt." Frank's eyes hardened slightly. "That's because someone warned me." For the first time, Ricky looked toward Sonia. She stood near the service station, frozen. Her pulse hummed in her ears. Frank followed Ricky's gaze. "This woman risked her job tonight," he said quietly, "to stop something you ordered." Sonia felt every eye in the room shift toward her. Ricky's expression twisted. "She lied." Frank shook his head slowly. "No." He reached into his jacket pocket and removed the small folded paper. The note. He placed it on the nearest table and opened it carefully. The handwriting was cramped and hurried. "Don't eat. The meat is spoiled. Intentional. They want to hurt you." Frank looked at Sonia. "You saved someone's life tonight." Sonia didn't know what to say. Her throat felt too tight to speak. Across the room, Ricky's composure finally shattered. "You think this changes anything?" he shouted. "You can't ruin my life over one stupid mistake." Frank studied him quietly. "This wasn't one mistake." He nodded toward the lawyer again. 3 years of theft, then toward the recording device. Attempted poisoning. And finally, toward the entire room. Public humiliation of an employee who tried to stop you. Ricky's hands trembled. "You can't do this to me." Frank's voice remained calm. "I already have." As if summoned by the statement, the distant wail of sirens began to echo through the street outside, growing louder, closer. Several diners moved toward the windows. Blue lights flashed across the marble floor. Ricky's shoulders sagged as the realization settled in. Frank looked toward the entrance. "The police," he said quietly. And for the first time that night, Ricky Thornton understood that the evening was no longer under his control. The sound of the sirens grew louder. At first, it was distant, barely noticeable beneath the low murmur of the restaurant. But within seconds, the sharp wail of police vehicles filled the street outside. Blue lights flashed through the tall front windows, reflecting across the marble floor like restless water. No one spoke. Ricky stood frozen near the center of the room, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The confident posture he had carried all evening had completely vanished. He looked smaller now, not physically smaller, just exposed. One of the private security officers moved toward the entrance and unlocked the door before the police even reached it. Moments later, two officers stepped inside. Their dark uniforms stood in stark contrast against the elegant room of chandeliers and white tablecloths. The older of the two officers glanced around briefly before focusing on Frank. "Mr. Grant," he said. Frank nodded once. "Officer." The officer approached the table where the folded note and printed documents still rested. "I understand you have evidence of a serious incident." Frank gestured calmly toward the lawyer beside him. "My team has already secured the audio recording and the inventory reports." The lawyer handed the officer a folder. Inside were printed transcripts, timestamps, and copies of financial records. The officer flipped through the pages quickly, his expression tightening with each one. Meanwhile, the younger officer walked slowly across the dining room toward Ricky. "Sir," he said firmly. Ricky's eyes darted toward the door. For a brief moment, it looked like he might try to run, but there was nowhere to go. The security team stood near the entrance. The diners blocked the aisles, and the entire room was watching. "I didn't do anything illegal," Ricky said quickly. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he reached for Ricky's wrist. "You're being detained while we investigate the allegations." The words seemed to snap something inside Ricky. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. Several diners flinched. "You're taking his side because he's rich," Ricky continued, pointing toward Frank. The accusation hung awkwardly in the air. Frank didn't react. He simply watched. The officer remained calm. "I'm taking the side of the evidence." He nodded toward the table. "The recording and the witness statements." Carlos stood near the kitchen doorway, pale but steady. Sonia remained beside the service station, still trying to process everything happening around her. The officer placed one hand behind Ricky's back. "Please cooperate." Ricky struggled for a moment. "You can't arrest me for a conversation in a kitchen." The officer secured the second wrist. "We can arrest you for attempted food contamination, fraud, and theft." The handcuffs clicked shut. Metal snap. The sound echoed loudly through the silent dining room. Ricky's shoulders slumped as the reality finally reached him. "This isn't over," he muttered. The officer guided him toward the entrance. As Ricky passed Frank, he turned his head sharply. "You ruined everything." Frank met his gaze calmly. "No," he said quietly. "You did." The officers led Ricky out the door. The flashing lights outside briefly illuminated the restaurant once more before fading as the police car doors closed. The sirens stopped. For a few seconds, the restaurant remained perfectly still. Then the tension broke. Several diners began speaking at once. Some gathered their coats quickly. Others approached the lawyers with questions. One couple hurried toward the exit, whispering anxiously to each other. Within minutes, the elegant dining room that had once been full of conversation and wine began to empty. Frank remained standing near the center of the room. The plate, with the untouched steak, still rested on table 7. He walked over and looked at it briefly. Cold, forgotten, a quiet symbol of everything that had nearly gone wrong. Behind him, his assistant spoke softly with the officers who remained to finish documenting the evidence. The lawyers packed their files carefully back into their briefcases. Frank turned and scanned the room. His eyes found Sonia. She stood exactly where she had been during the confrontation, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Frank walked toward her slowly. The dining room felt larger now, with the crowd thinning out. The chandeliers still glowed above them, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Sonia straightened slightly as he approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, Frank looked different than he had earlier in the evening. Without the tension of the confrontation, the lines of exhaustion and experience on his face were easier to see. "You knew the risk," he said quietly. Sonia nodded. "Yes. You could have said nothing." She looked toward the corner table where the steak still sat untouched. "But I didn't." Frank followed her gaze. "That note," he said, "changed the entire night." Sonia gave a small, tired smile. "I just didn't want someone to get hurt." Frank studied her for a moment. The honesty in her voice reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. The reason he had built this company in the first place. He reached into his jacket pocket and held up the folded paper again. "You wrote 3 sentences," he said, "and those 3 sentences exposed everything." Sonia exhaled slowly. She hadn't thought about it that way. Frank glanced around the nearly empty dining room one last time. "This restaurant will close for renovations," he said. Sonia blinked. "What?" "New management." He looked back at her. "And a new beginning." Sonia felt the words settle in slowly. For the first time since the evening began, the weight in her chest began to lift. Outside, the last police car pulled away from the curb. The flashing lights disappeared into the distance. And inside La Meridian, the long night of truth was finally coming to an end. 3 months later, the doors of La Meridian opened again. The building itself had not changed. The same marble floors still reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. The same tall windows faced the street, catching the late evening light as cars moved slowly past outside. But something about the place felt different. The music was softer now, not loud enough to dominate the room, but present enough to make the space feel alive. The lighting had changed too, still elegant, still warm but less intimidating, less like a stage where only certain people belonged. At the entrance stood Sonia Williams. Her black suit fit perfectly, tailored but simple. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and the nervous tension that once lived in her shoulders had disappeared. When guests entered, she greeted each one with the same calm smile. "Good evening. Welcome to La Meridian." Some of the returning customers recognized her. They had read the news articles. The story had spread quickly after the police report became public about the manager arrested for fraud and food contamination, about the recording that exposed him, about the waitress who risked everything to stop it. But Sonia never mentioned that night. Not to guests, not to the new staff. She simply did her job, and she did it well. Near the entrance, mounted on the wall beside a small brass plaque, hung a simple frame. Inside the frame was a small piece of paper. The paper was creased, slightly worn, the handwriting hurried and uneven. 3 short lines. "Don't eat. The meat is spoiled. Intentional. They want to hurt you." Below the frame was the plaque. The engraving was simple. One act of courage can change everything. During orientation, every new employee stopped in front of that frame. Sonia made sure of it. Not to praise herself, but to remind them what mattered. Inside the dining room, the tables slowly filled with guests. Couples sat beneath the chandeliers. Friends gathered around wine bottles and shared plates. The kitchen moved with quiet efficiency behind the swinging doors. Carlos still worked there, but not at the grill station anymore. He now trained new cooks on food safety and quality control. Every ingredient that entered the kitchen was logged and inspected. Every dish was prepared under strict guidelines. Not because someone demanded it, because the staff believed in it. Around 8 o'clock, the front door opened again. A man stepped inside. His jacket was worn and dusty. His shoes looked like they had been repaired more than once. His beard was uneven, and his shoulders carried the cautious posture of someone who expected to be turned away. The hostess hesitated. For a moment, the room felt exactly as it had months earlier. Then Sonia stepped forward. "Good evening," she said gently. The man looked surprised. I don't think I can afford this place," he said quietly. Sonia smiled. "That's all right." She gestured toward the dining room. "We have a community menu for guests who need it." The man blinked in confusion. "A what?" "A menu with simpler meals," Sonia explained. "Available to anyone who asks." The man looked around the restaurant nervously. "No one will mind?" Sonia shook her head. "No one here will treat you like you don't belong." She led him to a table near the window. "The best seat in the house." The man sat down slowly, still unsure whether to trust what was happening. Sonia handed him the menu. "If you need anything," she said, "just let us know." He nodded, still stunned. As Sonia returned to the entrance, she passed the framed note again. For a moment she paused, not because she needed reminding, but because the memory of that night had never truly left her. The fear, the choice. The moment she realized silence would have been easier. And wrong. From across the dining room, a familiar voice spoke quietly. "You kept it." Sonia turned. Frank Grant stood near the entrance, dressed this time in a tailored suit. No disguise. No hidden cameras. Just the quiet presence of the man who owned the entire restaurant group. He followed her gaze toward the framed note. "It seemed important," Sonia said. Frank nodded. "It is." He studied the room for a moment. The relaxed conversations. The staff moving confidently through the tables. The man near the window, carefully studying his menu. "This is what I wanted when I built this company," Frank said softly. Sonia folded her hands in front of her. "Then I guess we're doing it right." Frank smiled faintly. He turned toward the door. "Keep doing exactly that." As he stepped outside, the cool evening air drifted briefly into the entrance. Inside, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm. Glasses clinked. Soft music played. Guests laughed beneath the chandeliers. And near the door, framed on the wall for everyone to see, 3 small sentences remained. A reminder that dignity was not something people earned. It was something they deserved the moment they walked through the door.